Hello, and welcome everyone to Network 2020's virtual briefing on French foreign policy and the 2022 elections. I am Joanna Gwozdziowski, Senior Program Advisor at the network, and I will be moderating today's discussion. For those of you who are not familiar with Network 2020, we are an international community that bridges the gap between the private sector and policy worlds. To learn more about the network and the various programs that we offer, please visit our website at network2020.org. Today, I have the great pleasure to introduce our distinguished panel of speakers. Their impressive and extensive bios can be found on the website, but I will give a very brief overview. Dr. Célia Belin is a visiting fellow at Brookings, where her expertise is in transatlantic relations and the impact of French domestic politics on foreign policy. She served as an advisor on U.S. affairs and transatlantic relations for the French Foreign Ministry policy planning staff. Professor Charles Kupchan is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and teaches international affairs at Georgetown University. He served on the National Security Councils of both the Clinton and Obama administrations, covering European affairs. He has numerous publications on the topics of geopolitics and the international order. Our third speaker, Tara Varma, is Senior Policy Fellow and the head of the Paris office of the European Council on Foreign Relations. Her expertise is in French foreign policy and European and Asian security developments. She is currently looking at the role Europeans can play in the Indo-Pacific region. Thank you, panelists, so much for joining us today. The upcoming French presidential elections in April will have a significant impact on France and Europe, as well as for transatlantic relations. Who are the major candidates, and how do they view domestic issues? And what will likely be their approaches toward foreign policy? How has President Emmanuel Macron's recent shuttle diplomacy during the Ukrainian crisis affected his campaign to win a second term? And how will this election shape the future of US-French relations? I look forward to discussing these and other questions with today's panel. So my first question, if I might turn to you, Célia. Who are the major French presidential candidates and what are their foreign policy views? Have any of them changed those views because of the recent Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Thank you, Joanna, and thank you for hosting us today. I'm very glad to be sharing the stage, the virtual stage with Tara and Charlie, and to be discussing these topics. I will start with a short overview of the major candidates, as you asked, and giving just a quick overview of their foreign policy views, knowing that the war in Ukraine has fundamentally, overshadowed everything else for the moment, in particular in terms of foreign policy. So I don't think we're going to get to discuss much other foreign policy topics than the relationship to Russia, the war in Ukraine, the relationship to Europe, and relationship to NATO. Arguably, these are the most pressing and important topics at the moment in French foreign policy. So regarding the candidates, first and foremost, this election will take place only in 26 days for the first round of the election. So this is a very a throw stone away. So it's not a very much time for an election that is still in largely a lackluster election that raises little interest from the public, mostly because a majority now believes that the likelihood is for Emmanuel Macron to be re-elected. So Emmanuel Macron in the polls right now stands at 30%, around 30%. He goes up and down from there. And he's far ahead from his main competitors that are mainly Marine Le Pen, who oscillates between 16 to 19%. And then, and she's obviously the far right nationalist candidate, who is probably underperforming from the fact that she's tackled by another far-right candidate, Eric Zemmour, who surged in the poll in the fall and stands now at 10 to 13%. You also have a classic Republican right candidate, Valérie Pécresse, around 11%, and Jean-Luc Mélenchon at the far left, around 11% as well. Remaining in this landscape is a bunch of socialist and green and communist candidates forming a sort of a fragmented left, altogether not adding up to 15% or something like that, but not uniting forces. So probably not in a position to compete for the second round of the election. So a clear Macron lead in the polls. And this is obviously due to the war. You had a rally around the flag effect, with Macron jumping 5 to 7 points in the poll extremely rapidly over the course of 2 or 3 weeks. But arguably, his lead was already pretty strong before the beginning of the war. This is due mostly to the fragmentation of the opposition. The strongest opposition probably comes from the nationalist right, Marine Le Pen, but it's now been entrenched in this deep far-right primary that never stops between Marine Le Pen and Eric Zemmour, and it's still remaining, it's still dividing this sort of opposition, strong opposition to Emmanuel Macron. The rest is highly divided, and this has been the case since 2017, when Emmanuel Macron really overcame the sort of classic left-right divide between the center-left and the center-right, which had been the sort of balance that had been experienced for the past 50 years, and that has been really questioned by the emergence of Macron's centrist center of politics type of policy proposal. But what's likely to happen, and that's I'm just gonna finish on that, and then we can go back maybe on foreign policy. What is likely to happen now is that more than ever, this vote in less than a month away will be a vote on leadership, whether Emmanuel Macron is the one that the French will choose to continue lead the country at the time of the war in Ukraine, or should they want a change. Because fundamentally, this is not a vote on policy. There was almost no space for policy debates prior to the war in Ukraine, because of COVID, because of also a lack of partisanship and a lack of a clear debate between who's on the left, who's on the right, with Emmanuel Macron sort of blurring the lines, which additionally, with the war in Ukraine, really transformed a classic vote on policy, which could have been the case or was the case in previous elections, to really a vote on leadership. Do we want Emmanuel Macron to continue lead the country? And those who oppose Macron on fundamental philosophical reasons, such as the far right and the far left, will continue to do so. So you will not see a decrease, or not much, of the 30%, electorate that votes for either Eric Zemmour or Marine Le Pen, because to them this is very much an identity vote. They vote against Macron and in favor of a nationalistic, far-right program, also pro-French, anti-European, etc. We can come back on this. Those who are likely to change their vote, or who feel the most effect from the war in Ukraine, are those who are potentially voting against Macron for his policies, but not for his political philosophy or his leadership. These people a month ago, 2 months ago, might have decided that they preferred, Valérie Pécresse's offer on fiscal responsibility, or they preferred Yannick Jadot's offers on the ecology. But right now, they are more likely to go and pick Macron because of the rally around the flag effect, because they'd rather stick with what they know, because they wouldn't want to change the leadership in the middle of a crisis, and because fundamentally, even if they disagree on the policies, they can live with the leadership. I think it's also an effect of a sort of reminder of what happened 2 years ago with the COVID crisis. Macron by now has demonstrated himself to be very much a crisis manager, to be a president for crises, more or less up to the task, even if you had here and there debates on whether he performed well with masks or with vaccines at certain points. He got the country through the crisis, and for that, the country can believe that he might be able to take the country through this crisis again. And I will finish with just one percentage to demonstrate that, is that when we ask Macron voters or people who intend to vote for Macron in a month, why would they vote for him? They say 55% of them say that it's because they trust him, and only 32% of them say that they agree with his ideas. And this number of people who vote for him and agree with his ideas is much, much, much lower than the type of than the percentage of people, for example, who pick Éric Zemmour. And 63% of them say it's because they pick Éric Zemmour because they agree with his ideas. Or 83% of people who pick Yannick Jadot, the Green candidate, say they also agree with his ideas. And for Macron, it's much lower. They vote for Macron not because they agree with his ideas, but because they trust him. And so the war effect, that's the fundamental war effect, I believe that we're going to see here.
That's just absolutely fascinating. So really domestic factors right now are on the back burner, and it is, like you say, rallying around the flag. So if you can really discuss on the foreign policy side, Célia, the other candidates, how do you see their views regarding foreign policy within Europe, the United States? Specifically, we look at Marine Le Pen, who's had funding by the Russians. How is that, this is a situation that we are in now could be quite difficult for her, I would imagine.
True. On the Marine Le Pen side, all the nationalist sort of pro-Putin candidates prior to the war were taken aback and on the wrong foot when the war started. So it's the case for Marine Le Pen, who had brochures printed out with her holding the hands of Putin that were supposed to come in the mail in the month of March and had to be thrown away, obviously, because that did not look good. And both Marine Le Pen, Éric Zemmour, but also Jean-Luc Mélenchon have at different times celebrated Vladimir Putin for different reasons. On the Zemmour and Le Pen side, it's mostly because he was perceived as a strong leader that was fighting terrorists in Syria and elsewhere. And on the Mélenchon side, it was mostly out of anti-Americanist, anti-imperialist visions that potentially Russia and also probably inherited long-term pro-Russian views on the far left in France. But mostly because of an anti-NATO, anti-US positions that Russia was therefore sort of the positive counterbalance. Suddenly, all these people had to change gear very rapidly. Marine Le Pen did so quite efficiently, probably, and she sort of she's basically said she supported Macron and that this war must be stopped. She's still holding her views that against NATO and mostly against the integrated France, going back to the integrated command in NATO. Jean-Luc Mélenchon again protested and decried the aggression, Russia's aggression. He has now videos resurfacing of him really being pro-Russia in the past, which is complicating his views. But you should not underestimate that there is a constituency in France that is a strong pacifist constituency. And Mélenchon is able to really play on the pacifist ideas of this constituency, pushing for the idea that, of course, we should condemn Russia's aggression, but we should also continue to condemn all imperialisms and all and NATO sort of provocations. And what he's really pushing for is now he's talked about getting all the countries together under a UN flag or going through OSCE types of routes to get to peace in the region. So he's really sort of putting forward the more pacifist internationalist flag that is quite liked on the left. That's for those who were in the and finally Zemmour is probably the one that is sticking to his guns the most, not necessarily on Putin, but clearly on not wanting to make Ukraine the big deal that it is. Zemmour has already said twice that the Ukraine war was a distraction for this election, that it was a way to avoid that it was preventing the French from really thinking about the real threats. And to him, the real threat doesn't come from the east; it comes from the south. And so he's kept saying that, including yesterday night. There was all candidates appeared on TV yesterday night presenting their different point of view. And he repeated the idea that the French were being distracted by the Ukraine war and that they should think about the great replacement of French society instead of caring too much about the territorial danger to Europe. That's for the nationalist side. Finally, everybody else with Macron in the center are sort of assembled under the same types of principles, mostly pro-EU, pro-NATO, a forceful response that corresponds to the majority of what the French are saying that they want. You have 62% of the French saying they are in favor of delivering arms to Ukraine, and most of the mainstream candidates say the same. They are overwhelmingly in favor of hosting refugees, same for the majority of the center candidates, which is, again, all the reasons why this situation favors Macron. Macron for basically, when everybody else sort of agrees with him, it's easier to be already in position and sort of ask for a repeat, rather than making the claim like Valérie Pécresse is trying to do or Yannick Jadot is trying to do, that a change would be welcome in the middle of this crisis. I'll stop here for now.
Great, thank you so much for setting the stage, Célia, for all the political political situation in France currently and the foreign policy concerns. So now if I could turn to Tara, if you could please discuss what have been President Macron's foreign policy and defense goals over these past 5 years, over this first term of his, which have been effective and which you think have been less effective?
Sure, thanks a lot, Joanna. So Macron arrived in 2017 on a very pro-European platform. He was this, kind of the outsider, the underdog at some point even. He was, François Hollande, the then president, his minister for economy. He was portrayed as someone very ambitious, but he had never run for an election before. And basically the first time he ran for election was to become the French president. And he was 38 or 39 years old at the time, so pretty young. I mean, it was both seen as a very bold, but also a bit crazy move. He was portrayed for a long time as a maverick, and I think he also liked that. I think he decided to take on the positive side of being a maverick. And so he had a very, very ambitious foreign policy agenda. He was not a foreign policy person at all. He had very little knowledge about it. He was really an economy guy, basically. He had worked in a bank previously, and he's one of those very high-level civil servants in France, but he knew little about foreign policy. When he was Minister of the Economy, his advisor for Europe is actually now the Minister for Europe, Clément Beaune. And so he's been with him for a long time. And I think Clément Beaune is one of the people who really gave this pro-European streak to Macron's program. And so when he was elected in May, 2017, and he gave in September a very famous speech, which we now call the Sorbonne speech, which is basically his manifesto. I mean, post-election manifesto, where he explains that he had very ambitious plans for European defense, rethinking the transatlantic relationship, rethinking relations with Russia, with China. I mean, there was a whole program there, rethinking our relationship with Africa as well. And I think this is one of the elements, and we'll come back to that, which he's developed more, especially trying to move away from the focus on security and defense, more into building a new relationship, especially with younger Africans, based on innovation, economy, a real partnership, basically moving from this development aid and development donor kind of relationship, but moving towards something very different. And it's been complicated for him. There have been a few hurdles, let's say this. First of all, so the UK had left the European Union the year before. So basically France was the only remaining really big diplomatic and military actor in the EU. And so there was some sort of responsibility for the French there too. And Donald Trump was the US president, and he had, as you know, made a number of declarations where he said that the European Union was a foe, even for the US, even worse than China. And so sometimes he insulted European leaders on Twitter, and then he tried to build a relationship with them. And this is something that Macron also has tried to do for a long time. He's tried to build very personal relationships with a number of people, Democrats and autocrats. And I think this is where it's been a bit problematic for him, because it is understandable that he would want to build personal relationships with heads of state from the EU or other countries. But when he tried to do the same, typically with Vladimir Putin in 2019, then there was kind of a backlash from other European partners. And so I think he was very conscious that in a world where, according to him, the US security guarantee wasn't there anymore, there was a sense for the EU to become a more autonomous actor. And it didn't have to be actually against the US. I think the whole strategic autonomy debate was slightly exaggerated. I think his sense was the US is saying that it doesn't want to be with us on a number of military interventions or foreign policy fronts. And so in the light of this decision by the US, we still have security concerns for the EU, and what can we do? Because we rely on the security guarantee of the US, and if they decide to withdraw, then we will find ourselves in really complicated situations. And I think he's pushed the Europeans in that direction. He's not done so always very subtly or nicely. I would say he's tried to rock the boat a lot, and so he very often put the Europeans in front of his decisions, declarations, and that has led at times really to a lack of cohesion inside the EU and to a number of European partners basically leaguing against him. And it came to a point, I think the Russia rapprochement was really one of these examples where things could have gone really bad, because so in August 2019, he hosted Vladimir Putin into his summer house. And a few days later at the ambassadors conference, he said that he wanted to have this rapprochement, that he knew that the French deep state, so the diplomatic system, would be against it, but nevertheless, we should pursue this idea, because he was really afraid of Russia and China forming an alliance. And to him, this alliance could only be against European interest. And his idea at the time was, if we extend another hand to Russia, then hopefully they won't partner with China. Honestly, the logic of that to me was a bit skewed, because Putin could both have access to the European market and still be close to China. But I think there was a sense for Macron at the time, and particularly by the people who advised him, that we needed to do more to get basically Putin back, or Russia back, into the European sphere. In his speech, it wasn't clear whether this was a Franco-Russian bilateral initiative, which I think would have been fine, or a European initiative. And I think the ambiguity came from the fact that he spoke about rethinking the European security architecture. And this is where Europeans, of course, decided to raise their hand and ask, first of all, what Macron was thinking of putting on the table, who had told him that he could speak in the name of all other Europeans, and where this would lead. And I think there's been a few of those moments where the Macron method was a bit harsh, and it led to a number of conversations. Well, I have to say that hadn't happened before, so probably they were also good for European strategic culture, the importance also for Europeans to think about all these issues. And I think that's particularly true now that we are a few thousand of kilometers away from the war. And so all this happened, and in the midst of that, of course, the security situation in the Sahel deteriorated dramatically. It's been deteriorating even now, to the point that the French ambassador has been expelled from Bamako in Mali, that diplomatic relations are clearly not at their best. There are Wagner mercenaries operating in the Sahel against European and French interests. And so we're seeing all of this happening. Also, of course, China, and I know this is of interest to our American listeners. So there was the comprehensive agreement on investment that Angela Merkel, the then German chancellor, wanted to pass absolutely to be able, to kind of have this new trade relationship with China. And this ultimately didn't go through because there were a number of provisions in the CAI that a lot of parliamentarians decided to go against. And also the communication around the CAI and the way it was done, trying to sign it basically a day before the end of 2020 didn't help either, especially at a time where I think what the European public saw was that strategic autonomy, again, was not against the US, but it was about Europe trying to build itself a better defensive system. The strength of the EU is in its economic nature, and a lot of our geopolitical rivals are interested by this European market. The whole point of the EU is its openness, the access to everything, but this is, I think, what we've seen now is that it has become also one of its biggest vulnerabilities. So the EU is thinking about becoming stronger, again, not being offensive, but providing a number of defensive instruments that would ensure that its openness is not taken hostage basically by other powers. And so he's been pushing for all those issues, but at the same time, it's been quite a big struggle, I would say. In retrospect, what's happening in Russia, I would guess, qualifies now as a relative success for him, in the sense that what was a big vulnerability, the idea that he kept reaching out to Putin without completely coordinating and consulting with allies, has now turned into something, again, I would say really relatively positive, in that he is basically one of the last communication channels between Putin and the West. And Putin is still talking to him. And so basically, he doesn't want to talk to EU leaders at all, either Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president, or Josep Borrell, the High Representative for Diplomatic Affairs. And so there is one person in the EU whom Putin is talking to, well, two now with Olaf Scholz, but basically it's the German Chancellor and the French President. And we need to see where this takes us. But I think he'll be able to say that he'll have done, if we come to a point where there needs to be more military assistance from the West, I think Macron will be in a position to say that he will have literally done everything that he can to prevent the war, and it will not have worked. But in a way, this is, I don't know, it's a relative, I wouldn't say success, but it's not a failure. The Sahel situation, he inherited it from before, and it really massively deteriorated in the past few months. When it comes to China, there is actually very little in French public debate on European China or French China relations. There are a few really good experts, but it's not so much in the debate. And on the US, relationship with the US, it's been very much in the debate after AUKUS, but I would say not in a very knowledgeable way. Célia alluded to it. A lot of the then candidates, when the AUKUS scandal, well, what we call the scandal, happened, a lot of our decision makers called for France withdrawing from NATO integrated command. There was a lot of emotional overreaction, I would say. But I think now there's a sense that it's a bit more balanced. And we can talk about European perceptions later. I can see also that the hour is turning by and there are a few questions, and Charlie needs to intervene too. So I'll stop here, and I'm happy to get into more details if need be.
Great. Thank you so much, Tara, for that, great summary of Macron's policies. There's a lot of ground to cover there. And now for the US perspective, Charles, if you could talk about historically, what have US-French relations been like, very briefly, and what have been our relations under President Macron?
Well, I mean, the relations between the US and France have been, we've been allies ever since 1778, when the US was losing the Revolutionary War and reached out to the French, and the French helped us out. The United States was rather ungrateful. In 1793, the French asked us to return the favor, and George Washington issued the Proclamation of Neutrality. So it left a bad taste in the mouth of the French, but that's all behind us now. And I think there was really a turn in French policy under Sarkozy, when the sort of a Gaullist prickliness about American hegemony, about France being part of NATO's integrated structure was laid to rest. Some of it came back under Macron, but it was more rhetorical than it was policy. And so in many respects, I think the relationship between France and the United States in a strategic sense is good as it's ever been, in part because of Brexit and a shift of American diplomacy from the UK to France and Germany. And in many respects, France replaced Britain as America's go-to partner of choice. And going back to the counter-ISIL campaign, as well as the counterterrorism efforts in Mali that Tara was just talking about, the French really did emerge as the closest strategic partner of the United States, and now that is coming back into focus with the war in Ukraine, and the degree to which, in many respects, Macron's call for greater European, I mean, he uses the word autonomy. I prefer to use capability, because autonomy suggests Europe is going to be acting on its own. But I think this crisis underscores, if anything, the need for the United States and Europe to be acting together, even if we see more European capability. And in some ways, what Putin's actions have done is light a fire under Macron's rallying cry. I mean, I'm sure that he never expected Germany to come out of the starting gate and spend $100 billion on defense and buy new fighter aircraft and start sending lethal weapons to Ukraine. I mean, this is all kind of, it makes all of us kind of astonished, because, I'm sure all three of us have spent plenty of time in Germany over the last several decades, and Germany was just deeply averse to any geopolitical vocation. This was in its DNA, and all of a sudden, the Germans have woken up. I'll end with just one cautionary note, and that is that I think that the crisis in Ukraine has brought NATO back to its traditional mission of collective defense. There is a purposefulness and a solidarity to the Atlantic relationship now that is quite stunning. Here in the United States, people are wandering around with Ukrainian flags. They are protesting in front of the Russian embassy. They're dumping out Russian vodka across the United States. There really is a kind of coming together here. But my one final comment would be, let's not forget that the same issues that we were all grappling with before Russia invaded Ukraine are still with us. Here in the United States, inflation, which is going up, deep polarization. Yes, Europe is bringing in a vast number of refugees, and it is doing so with great generosity and great welcome. But there will be a knock-on effect, right? The immigration debates in France, in Poland, in other countries, they're not going away. They're actually going to get more intense. And so, yes, this is a moment of reckoning in which the Atlantic community has come together. The United States and France are in some ways leading the effort to push back against Putin, even as Tara was talking about, Macron has tried to play the role of mediator. But let's just keep in mind that everything that we were talking about in terms of illiberal populism, the domestic challenges facing the United States and the European Union, these are not gone. They are simply, for now, no longer in the limelight because all of us are watching what's happening in Ukraine.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Charles. I think now maybe I will look at the Q&A and pose some questions. And actually, there's one question which kind of follows on to something that you just mentioned, Charles. Are the French welcoming the news of German rearmament? Would you like to tackle that question first, Charles?
I haven't actually been following the French media or pronouncements, so I'll turn to Célia and Tara for that. I would think, in theory, that they are welcoming German rearmament with open arms, in the sense that it does play right into Macron's call for a stronger European geopolitical identity. The one issue that I think remains to be, sorted out is the French will continue to envisage a more autonomous, independent European capability, what Macron likes to call European sovereignty. The Germans, even as they acquire more geopolitical capability, will see this in the service of transatlantic unity and solidarity. So yes, I think the French are happy to see the Germans get real, but there will be this difference in broader strategic vision for the foreseeable future.
All right, thank you. Célia?
Probably Tara has more, maybe numbers even from the quotes. I will just add one point to what Charlie said, which is absolutely on point. The French, I would expect, would welcome this news, in particular because they were looking for a competent partner in Germany to address some of the security challenges out there. One of them for France, the top priority has been for the past 7 years, at least or more, a counter-terrorist priority. So mostly in the south, obviously in the Sahel, North Africa, Middle East, and always hoping to find European partners for security missions, such as their attempt to Europeanize the missions in the Sahel. However, this sort of rearmament of Germany comes with this idea that all of this is first and foremost in the works of a territorial defense against the Russia threat, mostly focused on Eastern Europe, on this geography, which is a fairly different geography from what France is used to. And so down the line, France might find itself a little bit more isolated in making the case in Brussels that the sort of what happened to the South still matters a lot to Europe's stability as well.
All right, thank you. Tara?
So in theory, the French are very happy. They feel absolutely comforted, and basically they're saying, for the past 5 years, we've been saying that we need to invest a lot more in European defense, and Germany is the most important economy of the EU. It has actually the financial means to do it. And clearly they literally, Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, and Christian Lindner, the Minister of Finance, decided overnight to add this 100 billion euro budget line. So when there is political will, sometimes things happen. There is already a controversy over the announcement by Germany today that they were going to purchase F-35 to replace the Tornadoes. And so basically a lot of French commentators, I have to say not very knowledgeable, are saying, well, you see, last Thursday and Friday at the Versailles summit, we said that it was the beginning of the geopolitical awakening by Europe, but ultimately when Germany has to make a decision, it buys US industrial defense capabilities. So I think this is slightly absurd, and it was certain that in the framework of, I mean, almost certain that Germany would buy F-35s, especially if it's to carry, if it's in the framework of the nuclear sharing agreement inside NATO. But there is already a controversy in France about the fact that Germany is basically procuring US equipment and not European equipment, basically AKA French equipment. So happy and not so happy, I would say.
All right, thank you. We've got several questions about the Sahel, about French policy in the Sahel and the recent disappointments with the coup d'etats and Islamic resurgence. So I think maybe Tara again, or if someone else would like to address that question.
I can go very briefly. I mean, honestly, I was looking at the questions in the chat. I can't read in tea leaves, so I don't know what we'll do next. But for sure, right now, tensions have mounted to the point that our ambassador was expelled by the Malian government. So, that's in diplomatic lingo and diplomatic world, it's pretty bad. They can get better, but the French have been asking the Malian junta to stop working with Wagner mercenaries, and the Malian junta has not complied with this request. Quite the contrary, actually, it's working very closely with these mercenaries, and I think as long as they do so and so openly, it's going to be a problem for the French. So hopefully after the election, maybe there will be a way to rekindle the relationship. But we are also hearing more and more by investigative reports of human rights violations in Mali that would be committed by the Wagner mercenaries, but also Malian soldiers who are being trained by the mercenaries. So the situation is extremely complicated. There are, Mali is not the only country in the Sahel, but France intervened at the time in 2013 at the request of the then Malian government, which of course has been overthrown now. And so I think things can get better, but they are pretty negative right now. So we need to see how things evolve from here. And I guess I think there is really a willingness on Macron's side to try and move away from the security paradigm that has overly mobilized French and European resources in the Sahel, and to try and move on to a kind of a more productive economic relationship as well.
Thank you. Charles?
Yeah, the only point I would add is that, when Biden followed through on Trump's pledge to withdraw from Afghanistan, it was in some ways an indication of a broader strategic and geopolitical realignment. Been there, done that with the forever wars. We're now going to focus on Eurasia, the European and Asia Pacific theaters. And I was asking myself, well, who's going to pick up the slack? Who is going to deal with Mali and other parts in Africa? Who's going to deal with Syria? Who's going to deal with the Eastern Med? What about Libya? Is the EU going to rise to the occasion and stand up some kind of serious humanitarian / political effort in Libya? And I think we have the answer now in two respects. One, France is getting out of Mali, not getting in more. I don't know whether that suggests a broader pullback from Africa. I'm guessing the answer to that is yes, in part because we're all now going to be focused so heavily on Europe. And whatever the outcome is in Ukraine, whether they stop with some band in Eastern Ukraine, or they take all of Eastern Ukraine, including Kyiv, or they go all the way to the Polish border, we don't know. But I do think that, for now, we're headed back to some kind of Cold War division in which European members of NATO, the US, and Canada are really going to be focused on the Central Front in a way that we have not been since the 1980s.
So if I could follow up with you, Charles, what do you think the Biden administration is thinking of Macron's Macron acting as an interlocutor with Russia, kind of pressing the Western cause? What do you think Biden administration thinks of that?
I think that the Biden folks are supportive of anybody who has an open mic to Putin. And there seem to be a bunch of different corridors that are in play. There's Macron, there's Erdogan, there's Bennett, the Prime Minister of Israel. And now there is talk of perhaps a Zelensky-Putin meeting. I don't know where that stands. I haven't caught up with the news of the last 24 hours or so. But I do think that right now we're not in a position in which there does seem to be a diplomatic breakthrough in the offing. And I'm guessing that Washington is supportive of all efforts to try to communicate to Putin. And I have to say, I've been struck by the reactions of Mr. Macron and French senior officials who have been giving readouts of the conversations with Putin that are not very optimistic. In fact, they're the opposite. They're saying, Putin's in the bunker. He's not getting good information. He may well take the whole country. So, let's keep trying. Let's keep talking. But the picture right now looks like the Russians are not negotiating in good faith. Rather, they're buying time and buying cover to pummel Eastern Ukraine.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that. And then this question for Célia. Macron and Boris Johnson often disagree in public. What can you say about the state of French-UK relations?
Well, not much at the moment. It's taken it's sort of background now in the framework of this war in Ukraine. The UK is, as much as the rest of Europe and the US, united in purpose and in action for the moment. It has been very, very forceful. One of the few European allies who really trusted the Americans when they were sort of warning of the troop buildup and the Putin's intent for invasion. And so arguably the UK was one that rang the alarm bell earlier than others. The British-French relationship really got degraded. Sorry, I'm losing my English here. Got really, really bad at a moment when both sides could afford it. I think after the negotiation of the withdrawal agreement, both sides were trying to maximize their hands. And really, the French were confident that they had the full support of the EU in most negotiations, and while the UK was trying to cherry pick, the fights on which they could start pushing Europeans and France on a certain amount of elements that the previous government had already agreed on. So the French considered it was bad faith on part of the Brits. But by and large, all of these back and forth was mostly due to the fact that this was there was nothing standing in the way, nothing too dangerous looming out there, and so basically they could afford to enter disputes over the future mode of relation between the UK and the EU. Fast forward to this situation, we are in an entirely different situation. Even the sort of the AUKUS deal that was considered a betrayal by the French when the UK and the US, together with Australia, passed on the the submarine deal that scraped the French deal on submarines with Australia. The UK was really perceived as an opportunistic partner, that opportunistic ally of the US that just did that to the detriment of France. But 6 months later, really that is not the question right now. The UK is an important element in the sort of in the unity front that that Europe and the US is trying to build, and so as such it will play a strong role. So I would expect all the disputes to be on the back burner for a while.
Thank you very much. And then Tara, we have a question about what role do nuclear weapons play in French foreign policy, you know, especially given that Putin has been mentioning and threatening use of nuclear weapons. What do you think that policy is for France?
So for France, it's a French policy. We haven't Europeanized our deterrent. France is now the only country in the EU that is a nuclear weapon state, with the departure of the UK in 2016. We have a very special agreement with the UK that says that if either of our partners' vital interests are threatened, then we can activate the deterrent. But that is a special agreement that we have only with the UK that dates back to 2010. During each of their mandate, French presidents give one speech where they outline their vision of what the French deterrent should be. In the past years, with Chirac, with Sarkozy, with Hollande, there were brief allusions to the idea not of Europeanizing our deterrent, but of discussing it with European partners. This is still a big taboo in Germany, so I'm hoping that maybe now things will change and we could relaunch the discussion. But for a number of our partners, all of whom are in NATO, basically the nuclear deterrent has to do with NATO and lies with the alliance and the US, basically. Macron gave his nuclear deterrent speech in February 2020, days before the first lockdown and the pandemic hit. And so in this speech, he didn't offer to Europeanize the deterrent, the French deterrent, but he said that he was willing to discuss it with European partners should they want to. And so he basically put it on them to ask France to have this discussion. This would, if it happened, it would be a very long discussion. There would be many operational hurdles and there would be a need to solve this. But basically, it was quite intelligent on his part. He said, we're willing to discuss it if you bring the topic to the table. The pandemic happened and the topic disappeared completely. If he is re-elected, he'll have to give another speech. And so maybe it will be an opportunity for him to discuss it again and to maybe put a more formal and open proposition on the table. But basically in the campaign, it doesn't play a role because France's vital interests are not put at stake for now. The whole point of the deterrent is that your adversary is supposed to push not too many buttons that would lead you to push ultimately the big red button. So it's not playing a role, but it is a big part of the responsibilities of a president. And I have to say, one of the problems that we're facing in France generally right now is that foreign policy is not a big, this time the war in Ukraine and the relationship to Russia is a big part of the national debate, but all other topics, our relationship with the US, our relationship with China, what we need to do in Africa, this is not really part of the debate. And particularly everything that the nuclear deterrent entails when you're president, this is also not part of the public debate. So this is a problematic element, I would say, because it's not that there could be a lot of transparency, but I'm not so sure all the other candidates who are not the incumbent know everything that comes with the nuclear deterrent. So yeah, right now, basically, it doesn't play a big role.
All right, thank you very much. Charles, did you want to add something or? No,
I think Tara covered the bases.
Okay, very good. All right, well, we're running short of time. We've got 3 more minutes. And I kind of always try to end on a more positive note if I can. So my question to all of you, and maybe I will start with you, Célia, is what do you think is France's strongest asset within the context of Europe and international affairs? And how should it use this asset moving forward?
That's a trick question. You know, it's too easy to say our culture, our soft power. So that's always really tempting because I believe France, as much as the rest of Europe, remains a place that attracts not only tourists but scientists of all corners of the world, attracts some of the brightest brains out there, and even if there's of course a very strong competition with the US on that front, both transatlantic partners remained a place, and I think it's going to be striking after this crisis because all the most liberal, open to the world Russians are now rushing out of Russia because of that particular reasons, being deprived of their freedom and liberties and capacity to live their life over there, are going to be seeking new opportunities elsewhere, and Europe and France remains one of the places where this happens. But I would say outside of that, one of the big leverage that France still has is a very strong diplomatic capability. Very often it is said that France punches above its weight because it's still considered the third diplomacy in the world behind the US and possibly China, for the capacity to be present everywhere, to have a leader-to-leader relationship everywhere, to have professional diplomats that are, that speak many languages and have our firsthand knowledge of on-the-ground situations, which allows France, when it's well implemented, to either be a good partner for crisis resolutions, conflict management and resolutions, or to lead massive diplomatic initiatives, such as the COP21 in Paris in 2015, or being strong partners on the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. For all of these reasons, you end up with France, still at the table on so many of these incredibly important international topics, and this I believe will remain, in particular because Emmanuel Macron, and who is at this point quite likely to be re-elected, really believes in this capacity to utilize French diplomacy, sometimes a little bit too personal, in my opinion. And he seems to forget that there's a structure behind him, but he still, as many of his predecessors, still intend to have France have a voice on the international stage, and is well served by his administration to do that.
Great, thank you so much. Charles?
I think I'll circle back to where the conversation started with Célia, and this will sound a little bit kind of off tone, but I still believe that our greatest threat today, despite what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, is us, is what we've witnessed over the last 5 or 10 years, and that is illiberal populism and the erosion of ideological centrism in the West. And I think that what's happening in France, what's happened in Germany, what's happened in Italy is, for me, a reassuring sign that the center is holding. And it held right through the pandemic, which is a big deal, because I think we all could have thought that the pandemic would advantage the populists, and it didn't. And now I think the war in Ukraine will further strengthen the center. As Célia was discussing, people are going to vote for Macron, not necessarily because they agree with his particular policies on this, that, or the other thing, but because they're scared and they want someone who they think can kind of handle things. And who knows what's going to happen here in the United States. We're headed into midterms that could change the trajectory of American politics. But I do think that the United States and France have together been anchors of Republican ideals, really going back to 1776 in this country and soon thereafter in France. And I think that mission, that common mission, is today as urgent as it's ever been.
Thank you so much. And Tara?
Well, I encourage you to read our latest policy brief, which is available on ECFR's website, which says that basically Europeans want French leadership. And when it comes to diplomatic affairs, we conducted a poll in 12 member states, and so we have really interesting data. Everything is accessible on the website. So I would end on the fact that we have an interesting diplomatic leadership that we will probably need in the coming weeks. So that's one of our assets. And I'll end here. And thank you very much for your invitation.
Well, I want to thank Célia, Charles, and Tara for a fascinating discussion. We have so many more questions that we could ask, but I just want to say thank you so much for Network 2020 and for joining us today and providing such valuable insight, and looking forward to the elections in April. And for the rest of our audience, I would like to say that we have one upcoming event at the network on April 5th with Taylor Fravel. It's a members only event, and he will be discussing the Chinese military strategy. Again, that is on April 5th, and it's a members only event. So if you are interested in joining Network 2020, please visit our website to join. Also, these briefings that we do virtually, they are free. We participants from all around the world. We'd love to continue with such briefings. So if you feel inclined to donate as well, then we would love for your support. So thank you again today for a fantastic discussion, and I wish everyone a really great afternoon or evening wherever you are. Thank you.